With that, I'm going to go through the argument I make in this book. I'm going to finish with something of a cultural argument about why this matters so much. But I'm going to start with a very personal reason why I wrote this book in the first place, because a book about boys and men, a book about masculinity, a book about the way boys and men might be struggling is necessarily one that's going to invite certain questions. And so as one podcast host asked me, "How dare you?" as the opening question, because inevitably the question that will be in someone's mind if you're asking how are boys and men doing, oh, and look at the way boys and men are struggling now, which is, wait, what? Where have you been for the last 10,000 years? What are you talking about? And those are fair, reasonable, and honorable instinctive reactions to this, which I frankly share. But at the same time, I can't avoid the data points which suggest that for many boys and men, actually they are now on the wrong side of lots of inequalities. They are struggling for all kinds of educational, economic, cultural reasons. And that to look away from those just because we are simultaneously going to continue to argue in favor of women and girls in many areas is a failure not only of imagination and of intellect, but it turns out to be a massive political and cultural failure too. Because problems don't go away just because we don't address them. They go somewhere else. If we don't address these questions and try to provide answers, somebody will. And we may not like who that person is. And I'm going to finish with a discussion of that when we get through it. But before we do that, I'm going to talk about why another book on men. Because it's not as if I'm the first person to write about this. This is Hannah Rosen's book, The End of Men, from about 10 years ago, based on an Atlantic article. This is Manning Up by Kay Heimowitz. This is Phil Zimbardo and Nikita Coulom's book, Man Interrupted. These are all the last decade. Man Out is from the Brookings Press, where I published, also about men a few years ago. This is A Boy Crisis by Warren Farrell and John Gray. So really, another one? Why? And I think if you're going to write a book, you should have a good answer to that question, at least in your own mind, so that as you're trying to get the thing done, you remember why you were doing it in the first place. And the first reason is a bit personal. I think all scholarship is at least partly autobiographical. It's just a question of whether we admit it to ourselves or not. We are drawing on our own experience one way or the other. And a bit of it's even about me, frankly, remembering the agony of school for me at certain points and how much I struggled in remedial English, struggling to sit still, imagining worlds for myself so that I could survive the classroom, finally recovering educationally. But I won't forget those experiences. And then I raised 3 boys. So here they are. The book is dedicated to them. So you can see that's me, and that's George, that's Bryce, and that's Cameron. And this is an old picture. And the reason I've chosen this picture, it's the last time that I was taller than all of them. Yeah, now all taller than me. So there are modern pictures, but I prefer this one. As far as I'm concerned, this is when time stopped. They're all now in their 20s. I've raised them both the UK, where I'm from, and the US. And I've seen the world a little bit through their eyes as well, some of their struggles and the questions they've asked. And so that's been part of the story. But then as I was working on issues around social mobility, class, racial inequality, educational disparities, I just kept stumbling across data points, some of which I'm about to share with you, that just made me think, we have to do more about this problem. It wasn't so much stumbling in some cases as running into the data points and bruising my shin in the process, because some of them were so startling, and I didn't think we were having a good conversation about them. And I genuinely thought that as a Brookings scholar, someone with something of a reputation for looking at issues of inequality and equity, there was an opportunity for me to try and add some value to the debate in a number of ways that I'm going to go through now. And one of the ways I do that is by trying to get our facts straight. This is C.P. Scott, the founding editor of The Guardian newspaper. And this is a famous comment from him. Comment is free. We should all be free in a liberal society to share our opinions and views, but facts are sacred. And the sacredness of facts is something that I think we're in danger of losing. And so I thought it was quite important to try and get some just hard facts on the ground, make sure they were fairly represented as to what's actually going on with boys and men. Start with the facts, and then see where that leads us. So here are some facts. This is a chart showing you the suicide rates for men in the US in 1999 and 2019. So, and by age. So starting from the top, you can see men, young men, then 25 to 44, and then 45 to 64. Men at the top, women at the bottom. And then you can see the change in that period. What you can see is that suicide rates have sadly increased for all those groups. but they've increased more for some, especially middle-aged men. And they are 4 times higher for men than for women. So it's a relatively clearly established fact that depending on the nation, it's between 3 and 4 times higher suicide rate for men than for women, risen about 25% in the last decade or so. So this is like a very stark way, I think, to start a conversation like this, but in some ways it feels to be an appropriate place. Because if we're going to try and find one of the most tragic symptoms of all of a group that are struggling, taking your own life, and I came across some work by an Australian researcher, Fiona Shand, who did some analysis of the words that men used to describe themselves before they lives. And the 2 most commonly used words by those men were useless and worthless. Now, of course, these are suicidal men, and so we're going to expect words that are negative. But nonetheless, that seems to me to carry a certain additional resonance, which is there's a kind of point where, like, what's the use of me? What worth do I have? Maybe actually people will be better off without me. Am I really needed? And if I'm not, then perhaps suicide becomes a less crazy idea. And so although it's a very tragic thing to think about, I do think it's important both to get that fact on the ground. Now I'm going to give you some more facts. So I'm going to back up now and go into some areas. And there are a lot of charts coming. Fair warning, I am, after all, a Brookings senior fellow. Like, we get anxious if we don't have charts and PowerPoint slides, right? I have to have them. It's like a comfort blanket for me. When I ask my wife, I talk to my wife, I'm constantly asking data points. She says, "How was your day?" And I say, "Do you mean mean, median? What's the variation? What's the scale? Is this a 10-point ordinal rank scale? Like, be more specific. And if you would just follow me on Twitter, you wouldn't have to ask." You know how my day went, because I'm constantly tweeting out how my day is going. So there are charts coming. And I apologize in advance if I'm going to go over some quite quickly, and I'm very happy to come back. I'm also happy if there are things that just like, wait, I don't get that. What is that saying again? Or it's not clear. Do stop me. I'm also going to rattle through it in partly because I want us to have time for some questions too. And if I don't generate questions and challenges, then I will have done something wrong, because this is an area that has lots of questions in it. So let's do education first. Okay, this chart shows you, on the left-hand axis, for every 100 men, how many women are getting a 4-year college degree, that's the orange line, or a postgraduate degree, that's the blue line. It goes back to 1971, 72, and it comes up to close to the present day. What this is telling us is that there was, back in 1972, a pretty big gender gap, disfavoring girls and women. It caught up, and then, to everyone's surprise, kept going, overtook, and there is now actually a bigger gender gap in US higher education than there was in 1972. 1972 is when Title IX was passed, which is the legislation to promote women and girls in education. It was very successful, as this chart partly shows. Then things flipped, reversed, and so we now have a bigger gender gap in higher education in the US than we did in the days of Title IX. It's just the other way around. And so again, we can argue about why, and I'm going to get into some causal factors for that too, but those are the facts. And these are not in dispute, that there is now a very significant gender gap in higher education. I'm going to talk about UNLV in a minute, but across the nation and across the world. This shows you the share of young people in these selected OECD countries with tertiary education, college education, showing the gender gap. And you can see there's a gender gap in all of these countries. It's wider in some than others. It's narrower in Germany and Japan, for example, than in other places like Canada. The US is somewhere in the middle. Mexico's included in there just to show that I'm not only showing the ones where there's a big gap. Mexico has a very small gap, although it's likely to get bigger going forward. But the point here is simply this is not just a US phenomenon. It's not something weird about the US. There are very similar charts to this one in pretty much every advanced economy in the world. This great overtaking is shared. So then the question becomes, well, why? Well, let's drill in to a specific institution. I want to thank Caitlin Saladino for helping grab this data for me. This is IPED's data. And this just shows you UNLV enrollment by sex. So UNLV, if you just look at the most recent year, it's 43, 57% is the gap. So 57% female enrollment in UNLV. That's close to in line with the national trends. That's pretty similar to what we're seeing. We're close to 60-40 now on college campuses overall, but the enrollment is about this. This is roughly what I expect to see somewhere else. So UNLV is not unusual on that front at all. But of course, enrollment's only part of the story. To get that 4-year college degree, you have to complete. And there's a gender gap too. So this shows you UNLV's graduation rate for everybody, which is the red line over time, the last 10 years or so, a bit longer than that. And then you can see the breakdown. So blue is the female graduation rate within 6 years of enrolling, and the green is the male graduation rate within 6 years of enrolling. 6 years is the standard measure. If we do 4 years, it's even bigger gender gap, 10 years, a bit less. But what this shows you is that we're seeing about an 8 percentage point gap in finishing the degree within 6 years, conditional on enrolling. So of the ones that are enrolled, there's then quite a big gap 6 years later in terms of those who got a degree. So you have to put those two things together to get that big gap in college completion. It's an enrollment issue, but it's just as much a completion issue. It's helping the men who come to college complete college. That's a big part of the challenge. Now, why is that? Well, because the girls are doing so much better in high school. So what this chart does, and this is Ember Smith's work, she got the data and figured out a way to present it this way. This is high school GPA, ranked by decile. And a decile is, what's a decile, Mackenzie? 10% of the distribution. Yeah, 10% of the distribution, yeah. It's an in-joke because Mackenzie knew what a decile was, but then she also knew what a quintile, a quartile, a percentile, and a tercile was. And I have yet to meet anybody that hasn't done postgraduate economics that knows what a tercile is. Out more. Tercile. I only just learned what a tercile is. Tercile is a third, by the way. But these are deciles, so it's like percent. And what this is showing is if you rank the whole high school GPA distribution, the right-hand side shows you the top 10% GPA, 2/3 girls. Bottom 10% on the left-hand side, 2/3 boys, linear relationship in between. So the basic message of this chart is that in terms of GPA in high school, girls are just handing it to the boys. Massive gap. Now, this has all kinds of consequences because this leads into what happens in post-secondary education. GPA is a very strong predictor of going to college and succeeding in college. And increasingly, if we're going to use GPA instead of, say, test scores for admissions criteria, that actually accelerates the gender gap. So in more recent work than I was able to include in the book, we can see that the colleges which go test optional, in other words, the one that no longer require you to submit your SAT or ACT score, see a 4 percentage point increase in their female share. So they become even more gender skewed. And the reason for that is what you're looking at. Standardized tests are basically equal now. There's no gender gap to speak of ACT or SAT, but there's a big gender gap on GPA and on everything else. So going test optional accelerates that move, which is not to say that colleges shouldn't do that. GPA predicts success in college very well. It is just to say that that's the consequence of that policy change. So if we care about the gender skew, we should just think a bit about how we're doing admissions. Again, this is actually not published yet work from Brookings Mountain West, which Caitlin and her team have been working on, and it adapts work that I'd done with Ember Smith, looking at the geography of gaps. And what they've done here is to look at some of the Mountain West states that we have data for. And the kind of key takeaway, when are you publishing this? Very soon. But you better, because I kind of just did. So it's out there in the world now. And it's showing you a rank here, but what it shows you is, I want to focus here on the right-hand side. This is overall, but this is the English gender gap, the math gender gap. And what that's showing you is in terms of compared to a grade, right? So a 1 would be a grade level ahead on average, a full grade level ahead. And so what you can see is that in these states, there's a difference for one thing. So New Mexico is coming up, with a bigger gap where it's essentially a grade. Actually, some of the others are a little bit lower, but basically almost a grade level ahead in English. And then over here you see math, and here you can see a bit of a mixed story where there's actually not much of a gap in some states, although again in New Mexico, there's quite a significant gender gap in math in favor of girls. Nationally speaking, math is about a dead heat now, but the poorer the school district, the less true that is. So in the typical US school district now, girls are almost a grade level ahead in English, so that's consistent with this, and it's a dead heat in math. But in poorer school districts, there's a bigger gap in English, and the girls are way ahead in math as well. So the poorer the school district, the bigger the gender gap gets. This is primarily an issue, the gender gap issue, for men who are towards the middle and the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And I think this helps us to demonstrate that. There's other stuff going on in New Mexico as well that you'll know better than me. Same paper, same source. This is showing you on-time high school graduation rates for those states as well. It's consistent again with national evidence, slightly bigger gaps in some places, but overall there's about an 8 percentage point gap in on-time high school graduation between boys and girls, which to put in context is similar to the white-Hispanic gap, if we were just to do it by race. So not as big as the white-black gap, but then if we were to dig in, we'd see bigger gaps between black girls and black boys and other groups. Why is that? Well, hands up who's been through adolescence. Okay, all right, a few not yet. Hands up who's seen people go through adolescence. Hands up who has raised or is raising people through adolescence. Okay, and this chart will not surprise you. This chart shows you, oh, sorry, that was a mistake. This chart shows you what happens to our brains, right? So there's a big argument about the difference between male and female brains, but what there isn't any argument about is the timing of the development. So this chart shows you age across the bottom, girls on the left, boys on the right, and it's showing you two different things about our psychology that develop as our brains develop. Number one is sensation seeking. Sensation seeking is the orange line. This is from Larry Steinberg's work. The orange line is sometimes referred to by psychologists as the gas in the car. You know, it's the go, right? It's the, this is a great idea, let's go and do that. Or, hey, this will be fun. Or, to put it very personally, the most terrifying sentence to hear out of any young man's mouth. Here, hold my drink and watch this. This is a great idea, let's do that, let's go party, never mind about that, right? So that's, we're at gas. Now, there's another side of it, which is the brake, which is the blue line. That's impulse control. And that says, no, maybe it's not such a good idea. Maybe not take that drug, maybe not go, maybe not dive off the side of that road. You know, maybe not do that thing you're about to do, right? Maybe think a bit about the future, maybe think about the consequences. That's brake, right? Gas and brake. And as we become adults, we get a bit more balance between the gas and the brake. But adolescence, for both girls and boys, is a period where, yeah, there's the girls on the left, quite a bit more gas. Yay, let's go for it. That's a great idea, let's do that. And the brakes haven't quite developed as much. But then look at the difference between boys and girls. There's a big difference, and the biggest difference of all is in adolescence, where you're just seeing, particularly in these key adolescent years, right, for boys in particular, it's basically a lot of gas and not very much brake. Again, anybody been a boy? Anybody raised a boy? Anybody been around boys? Now, this is not to blame anybody. This is just how it turns out. And so what's happening is that girls are developing these impulse control earlier than boys and in greater measure. They're developing organizational skills. They're developing future orientation. They're getting their acts together sooner and earlier than boys. Again, more of a timing issue than anything else. It's not a judgment. But there are differences in what psychologists and neuroscientists call the prefrontal cortex. I don't know if there are any neuroscientists in the room. I hope to God not, because I'm about to butcher it. But the prefrontal cortex, a bit of your brain that's called the CEO of your brain, the organization bit of your brain. It's the bit of your brain that I like to think of as the turn in your chemistry homework bit of your brain. Right? Turning in your chemistry homework requires a heck of a lot of steps. You have to realize there's chemistry homework, take the chemistry homework home, do the chemistry homework, take the chemistry homework back into school, go to chemistry class, turn in the chemistry homework. I mean, that's a nightmare for a boy, on average, right? That's a lot of steps. And those are exactly the sorts of skills that show up in this kind of chart. Because GPA rewards staying on track, turning in your lessons, turning up, doing your homework, etc. It's not that girls are smarter than boys. They are not. Or the other way around. They're more organized. They're more future-oriented. They're more planful. Anybody that doesn't believe me on that, go into any 9th grade classroom you choose at random and just ask the girls and boys to open up their book bags and have a look. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest they're going to look a little bit different. All right, maybe it's just my boys, but it was like an explosion when they opened their book bags. All right, so what else is going on in school? First of all, there's this brain development difference. And adolescence, of course, turns out to be this very critical period in the education system, right? That's when the stakes are really high, when we've got to get our grades sorted out so we can go to college. The other thing that's happening in school is there aren't very many men there. So this is the share of men in education at different levels. right? And you can see that there aren't very many men at many of these levels, and it's falling. So now, today, only 24% of K-12 teachers are male, down from 33% in the 1980s and falling. I don't show pre-K and early years here, but the gap is much bigger there. That only between 2 and 3% of kindergarten teachers are male. And to put that in context, there are twice as many women as a share of the profession flying US military planes as there are men teaching kindergarten. Twice as many women flying military planes as men teaching kindergarten. I'm going to go on a limb here. I don't really care who's flying our fighter jets. I do to the extent that I want it to be equal, and there's a pipeline to military leadership, etc. But I will point out that we are going to great efforts, quite rightly, to make sure that our fighter jets are designed in such a way as to be more inclusive. We are redesigning ejector seats and the canopies and stuff so that it's not around the kind of standard male model mostly to allow more women to fly those planes. This is a huge and expensive undertaking by the US military, and I'm here for it. Show me the equivalent efforts to get more men into our classrooms or our kindergarten. Where's the political energy behind that? And I think that's a much bigger problem. I think the lack of men and the falling share of men in our schools is a problem. Interestingly, in private schools, private K-12 schools, the share of men is going up. So I think there might be something going on there about choice and preferences. We don't have enough men in our schools. All right, I'm going to briefly go through some trends in employment, well, because that's an area too where many men are struggling. But first of all, I want to give you some evidence for what I describe as the greatest economic liberation in global history. The greatest economic liberation in global history, which is the economic rise of women. I mean, it's just an extraordinary achievement that we've had in recent decades. So this is the wage distribution for women and men, women in orange and men, in 1979. The exact numbers don't really matter. It's just showing you what the shape is. And the point here is just very different, aren't they? And at that point, only 13% of women earned more than the median man, the average man, the man in the middle of the distribution. Only 13% of women were above him. So let's say the median man's about here. Only about 13% of the women are above him, right? Fast forward to today, this is what the distributions look like. So not 50% of women, but 40% of women now earn more than the average man, or the typical man, the median man. That's an extraordinary achievement. It's not full equality yet, and you can still see that the male distribution is not quite pushed out a little bit more. But wow, this is my lifetime. I was 10 in 1979. This is incredible progress. I should say this is full-time workers in exactly the same way we measure the gender wage gap. A massive transformation in the economic relations between men and women. Good. However, it has consequences for how men see their role in society. And to say that is in no way to say that we shouldn't have done any of this, that it isn't a wonderful thing. It is simply to acknowledge that social and economic changes of this magnitude and speed will tend to have other consequences that we should be responsibly addressing. This shows you simply that there's been a massive rise in wage inequality for both men and women, but the men's lines are the non-dotted ones, and this is median. I'm going to focus here on this one here. This is the median male wage. It's basically lower than they were in 1979. Whereas the hatched lines, which are for women across the distribution, have gone up. Again, it's the trend, not the level. But the key point here is that most men in America today earn less than most men in America did in 1979, adjusting for inflation. Just think about that for a moment. That is not likely to be something that has no consequences for our society, when most men earn less than most men did that long ago. Men at the top have seen an increase. That's some of my previous work. I do want to intersect by race, however, and make the point very briefly that there's been a huge difference in the rate of wage growth for different groups. So this shows you the wages for these groups in 79 and 2020. White men at the top, some wage growth. White women second, massive wage growth. Black men, very, very limited wage growth. And black women, bigger wage growth, but not enough to come up. So the key point here is we've got to think about these things through different lenses at the same time. White women now earn a lot more than black men, as well as black women. For every dollar earned by a white woman, a black man earns about 84 cents, which is about the same as the gender gap overall. So in other words, it's complicated. And it's particularly complicated by issues of racial inequity as well. This is again from the work I referred to earlier. No, it's not. I'm sorry. This is from an earlier paper, which looks at the gender wage gap for the under 30s in these Mountain West metros. And what you can see is that it compares it to the national national figure first of all. So for men and women in the 1930s, women now earn 93% as much as men up to the age of 30 nationally. And then you can see in these different metros in this area what the number is. In Las Vegas, 98%. So women in their 20s in Las Vegas are earning about 98% as men in their 20s in Las Vegas. So that's basically it. We're done. At that point, you're almost within a margin of error up until the age of 30. This is amazing. I mean, this is just extraordinary. Again, extraordinary progress. What does it mean then that we still have a gender pay gap at all? Why, if all this is happening, do we still have a gender pay gap? And the answer is we have kids. And kids have a much bigger effect on women's outcomes than male outcomes. And I might come back to that if time allows in a moment. But the other thing that's happening in the labor market is that we're seeing a reduction in traditionally male jobs in manufacturing, heavy industry, and so on, and a massive increase in what I call HEAL jobs, health, education, administration, and literacy. Huge growth in those areas. But men are less likely to be in those jobs than they were in the past. So if you think of HEAL jobs as the opposite of STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, these are health, education, administration, literacy, more women going into STEM, but fewer men into HEAL. I just want to draw your attention to this chart. Again, it's full-time prime-age workers. In 1980, you can see the share of men in those occupations. It's about 40% of social workers, 40% of elementary and middle school teachers, more than 60% of psychologists, very low numbers of nurses. Nursing has come up a little bit. Probably no coincidence that nurses can actually earn quite a bit more now than they could in the past, so there's definitely a salary effect here. But all of the others, there's just been this dramatic change in the gender segregation of these professions. That giant sucking sound, it's the sound of men leaving those professions. To the extent that something like psychology is now close to 80% female. It's happened unbelievably rapidly. So when people say these are female professions, just always say, wait, well, they weren't yesterday, right? This just happened. And I now have changed my mind about why this matters so much. I used to think it mattered because it's where the jobs were. That's true. But I now think it matters much more from a user point of view. When I wanted therapy, I was thrilled to be able to get a male therapist for the issues I was working on. Same with my son. If you have someone in a care home, and he's a man, you might want some of the men there too. Among psychologists under the age of 30, only 5% are now male. Psychology has just incredibly quickly become a female profession. And when we have the kind of mental health crisis that we currently face, which is affecting men and women equally but in different ways, why is that not a national scandal? Why are we not doing anything about that? Literally nothing about that. I do not at all mind the fact that Melinda Gates has just put $1 billion into helping get more women into STEM. But how much money are we spending on getting more men into HEAL? And the answer is nothing. And I'm going to suggest that now that's a bigger problem, not least for the next generation of boys. And then family life has massively changed, as you'd expect, given the economic changes I referred to earlier. So this again goes back to 1970. This shows you the share of women who earn more than their husbands, now up to about a third. This shows you women who are more educated than their husbands. This shows you percentage of households where women are the primary or sole breadwinner. 40% of households in the US now, women are the primary or sole breadwinner. This shows you the share of women with children under the age of 6 who are in the labor force. Used to be less than half, now it's most. Again, an economic revolution. And again, wonderful. But again, what does it mean for men? And the conservatives were saying that back in the 70s. What's going to happen to the guys if this happens? What if women no longer need men? What will happen? And what they said would happen is they'll form marauding criminal bands and light fires everywhere, and society will go to hell. They were wrong about that bit because violent crime rates have gone down. We've become a much more peaceful society. And this is where I'm going to risk a bit of controversy and say, you know, all those discussions about how terrible it is that the internet came along, and there's that's all their video gaming and porn. Well, what's the alternative? Maybe screens have helped to save us. Maybe actually it's better if our men are hiding in their basements online than marauding around the streets Mad Max style. But just because it's better doesn't mean it's good, to be clear. And I am very worried about the potential cultural redundancy of many of our men. Marriage is no longer the default institution into which children are born. 40% of births now take place outside marriage. Most births to non-college educated mothers take place outside of marriage. And within 6 years of parents splitting up, 1/3 of children never see their father again. We've got to rescue fatherhood from these changes in family life. Dads matter anyway. And we're stuck in this old model of how we make them matter, which is through marriage. And I'm not against marriage at all. It's still a great institution in many ways, but we've got to be realistic about the way the world is now, especially when you see this class gap. What this shows you is a share in 1990 and 2016 of births outside marriage, these different educational groups. It's doubled for those with a 4-year degree, but it's still only 10% outside marriage for those with the BA. But look at the other groups. So again, this is a class issue as much as anything else. And if you're only looking around at other college graduates, you maybe don't see some of these problems. But if that's the case, you're not looking in the right places. So what should we do? I'm all about solutions. I'm a policy wonk. I want to have solutions. So here are some which I'm going to give one line to each of them, partly by way of getting a debate going. Number one, let's start boys in school a year later. Their brains develop later. Let's level the playing field. They'll be a year older chronologically, but developmentally, they'll be closer. Private schools do this as a matter of course. In the course of my reporting, I discovered that it's very, very common in private schools and in upper middle class neighborhoods to hold the boys back for a year, so they get that extra year of brain development. Let's have more technical high schools. They're great for boys. They're neutral for girls, but they're great for boys. Could we have some more apprenticeships, please? The fact that 93% of apprenticeships are male is not a bad thing. Given what's happening in higher education, it's a good thing. So it would be great if we could do that. We are currently the worst in the world for apprenticeships of all OECD countries. I've already mentioned teachers, but especially in subjects like English, we need more male teachers. It turns out that areas like English really helps boys to have a male teacher. I know it helped me in English to have a male English teacher, and actually got me past some of my remedial English stages, to have Mr. Wyatt, a Korean War veteran actually, who taught us love poetry, Andrew Marvell's love poetry. And if you want to get a bunch of 16-year-old working class boys to weep over 17th century love poetry, it helps to be a guy. Just going to say that. It's also very good evidence that English is where it helps. But not only do we have fewer men in our classes, the subject they are least likely to teach is English, which is where they could make the most difference. Also, more male teachers means more male coaches for after-school activities. Let's give some subsidies and scholarships for men to go into these, just as we have scholarships for women into STEM, which again, I'm here for. Can we not do the same to get more men into these professions? Because right now, we're in real danger of hitting a tipping point where it's going to get harder and harder to persuade men these are careers for them. Even as we speak, it's harder to get boys to take psychology seriously as a career option because they see it as a women's profession. That was a horrible mistake that we even got to this point. I want equal independent paid leave for mothers and fathers. I said 6 months, and I say in the book, well, that's wildly utopian in the US. 6 months, you kidding me? Are we Finland? Since I wrote the book, the US military just introduced 3 months for each parent. Right? Okay, I don't feel quite so wildly utopian anymore. Maybe civilians could have it too. And then better treatment for unmarried fathers. Just today, I added this slide to show you that there's still some work to do. This is literally on the edge of the UNLV campus, just over the road from here. It's called GEMS, Girls Empowerment Middle School. I think they really wanted the name GEMS. It's all girls, STEM-based middle school, charter school. And again, great. But it seems to me that there's still something missing here if we're not also thinking about what would be the schools that would work well for boys. We're still, I think, stuck in this mindset that the big problem is we need more empowerment for girls in our schools. And that doesn't seem to me to be the problem anymore, given the data. It seems to me that we should be paying more attention to our boys. If we don't, other people will. Senator Josh Hawley, who may come and speak here himself, you should invite him, has a book of his own coming out. It's called Manhood. Rediscovering the Male Virtues. It's a much better title than mine, I'm going to be honest. And his book is coming out soon, and here's what he said in a preview speech for it, which is basically, if I can summarize, yes, boys and men are struggling because the left hate them, so you should vote for me. And if we keep telling them they're toxic, why do we think it's a surprise that they're withdrawing into the enclave of idleness and pornography and video games? I'm embarrassed to say that when I gave a friend this quote, he said, "Where is this nirvana?" But you know what Senator Hawley means. So he's turning into a political battle, right? It's about, if you tell them they're toxic, no wonder. And then, Enter this character. Hands up who doesn't know who this is. Okay. This is Andrew Tate, a Romanian British internet influencer. 12 billion TikTok views, huge influence, third most Googled person of last year after Donald Trump and Queen Elizabeth, and the most influential person for US teens of the year, according to a representative survey. He models, performs a version of masculinity which is reactionary, it's retrograde. He's been deplatformed, he's now been arrested for alleged rape and trafficking. And if you look at his content, what you'll see is just this ludicrous, cartoonish reaction against what's happening. But he will also say, well, no one else is talking about boys and men, and they're trying to deplatform me for saying it. And you can't just ignore 12 billion TikTok views. You can't ignore the interest in him. Or other figures, more serious figures like Jordan Peterson, and dismiss it as misogyny alone. What we have to do is recognize that what Andrew Tate and others are doing is providing an answer to the question, how should I be a man today? And if we, mainstream institutions of higher education and think tanks and government commissions and legislators, if we are not answering that question, and if we're not taking seriously these problems, then someone like Andrew Tate will come along. It is an axiom of political and cultural life that if there are real problems in a society and respond, not acknowledge and address them, irresponsible people will exploit them. That has always been true, it always will be true, and it is what's happening right now around boys and men. If we can't talk about this and acknowledge the facts and come up with solutions, then we're going to end up with figures like Andrew Tate and others saying, I'm here for you. Here's how to be a man. And if we don't like it, and we don't, to be clear, we better have some better answers ourselves rather than imagining that merely asking the question marks you out as somehow toxic or struggling. Thank you for your attention. I'd love your questions. Yes, lady at the back.
I loved your talk.
Thank you. Let's stop there, move on.
So my quick question is the following, is that I noticed on your solutions, you said that one of the solutions was to redshirt young men from kindergarten, like doing a second year of kindergarten. Is one that I raised a son, he's 22 and is about to start a PhD program in engineering. So didn't do too bad a job there. But
Yeah.
when it was suggested to me when my son was in kindergarten that I redshirt him, basically,
Yeah.
I reacted in a very negative way to that because I was really concerned that would crush him, and that I think instead of redshirting, have you thought instead about the possibility of having more male teachers
Yes.
at that age?
Okay.
I think
Yes.
that might be the better.
Yes. Okay. So I don't know if you all heard the question, but it was like, are there alternatives to redshirting, particularly as it might have these social consequences for being redshirted, including more male teachers? Answer, yes. But one of the reasons why I think we should just default to starting boys a year later is because, honestly, at that age, a lot of kids, they just don't know what's going on anyway. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. Whereas if you hold them back later, they really know what's going on. And particularly for certain groups of boys, we do that quite a lot. And you sure as hell know when you're held back a grade and it's 9th grade and 10th grade. So if you want to see a social impact, do it then. I think by doing it earlier and by doing it for all boys as a default, it seems weird now, but I think it could become seen as, well, that's just the way the world is. And there wouldn't be something wrong with you. Right now, if you're held back, there's something wrong with you. Interestingly, of course, as I said, all these private schools and upper middle class people, they're doing it. So what I'd really like to see, honestly, is just a more flexibility about school entry. You know, there are some places you're not even allowed to do it, and let parents choose a bit more. And then what they'll do is they'll choose, I think, in many cases, but for their boys to start later. This is now an open secret, I think, among kind of more educated and affluent parents around the school gates. And so I just think if it's an open secret among that group, maybe we should share it with others as well. But that's not to say we shouldn't also get more male teachers. We absolutely need more male teachers. I mean, and I've yet to find anyone that disagrees with that, by the way. But then the question is, okay, so how are we going to do that? And are we willing to spend money and political capital actually doing it? It's one thing to show charts saying, well, that's bad. Yes, I'd love more male teachers. I'm trying to find a school with male teachers for my son. Okay, what's the public policy implication? Are you willing to actually have scholarships for men to go into teaching? I am. But it seems to me that if you think it's a problem, you've got to be willing to take steps to address it. Yes. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are other cases where we can learn from other countries, either practices to perhaps build on or things to avoid.
Well,
and
I think
you mentioned apprenticeships and parental leave as two examples, but what else is there?
Yeah, so certainly, I mean, and technical high schools, right? So I think that one of the reasons why Germany does better in terms of gender gap is because it has technical high schools, and it's a big part of it too. There's a real fear of tracking in the US, and I understand why that's the case given the history. But I think we really need to just get over some of our concerns about the fact that there are just some students, and especially boys, who will do better in a more applied learning environment. That's just true. And putting them in a general public school because we're nervous about so-called tracking so they can just fail out of 11th and 12th grade is not doing them any favors at all. So I think that the investment in vocational is a really good idea. And I also see some trends like Scotland, for example, set a target to try and reduce gender inequality in its universities. It's very hard to do that. They have a big gender gap. They're at least setting out to try and do it. And Norway just created a commission on boys and men that's going to look particularly at mental health and employment. So when Norway is creating a commission on boys and men, you know that there is more appetite for the discussion. So I'd say at this point, it's as much about persuading people it's a policy area that needs addressing. We're still at that stage, but I see really good signs around the world that that's starting to happen now. Yes, the gentleman there.
Could you expand a little bit on your point regarding the apprenticeships? Are you talking about like vocational schools like welding and carpentry, or are you talking about STEM programs too?
Well, yeah, I mean, it can be both. The majority of apprenticeships are in the areas you'd think of, like welding, HVAC engineering, automotive engineering, manufacturing, etc. And they are, as I said, very male skewed, but they're not all that way. So there is increasing effort to get them in things like health administration, etc. Yes. Go ahead.
So just to follow up to them, we see an increase in jobs moving abroad as time
Right.
progresses. You see a lot of jobs moving
Yes.
to Mexico, to China, etc.
Yes.
So couldn't that be setting up a lot of people for failure?
Because there won't be the jobs for them. So they get the technical education, but there aren't those jobs waiting for them at the other end of it. Okay, great question. Well, right now, we have actually a dearth of people in a lot of those occupations. And so even as they have declined overall, many of them are still there. And if you think about things like HVAC engineers, automotive engineers, etc., they're not going away. They can't go to China. And so whilst it's true that overall there has been this decline, particularly in the male occupations as a result of free trade and automation, that's less true today. That trend is actually leveled out a little bit, and we do still need more people in those professions. It's just that they can't be the only things that men can do. We also need to get them into those heel professions as well. But it seems to me we can do both at once. We do need more plumbers. So I think that's perfectly reasonable to do that at the same time. Yes. I can't see the back very well, unfortunately, so if there are...
You had showed the picture of the gyms,
Yeah.
all girls.
Yes.
And I know in many private schools, certainly in the past, they had segregated, that there were boys'
Yes.
schools, girls' schools. What's your opinion about maybe going back to something like that?
Well, I just spoke at the International Conference of Boys' Schools, and it was very brave of them to invite me because they know I'm on the record as saying that the evidence for their effectiveness is just not there. So I did look at single-sex schools, and at least in the US, the best evidence I can see just doesn't show big effects. Now, there's a lot of problems, like that's quite old evidence, and some of these trends are getting worse in recent years. Secondly, it was just in terms of education, clear, narrow educational outcomes. And you might want other things too that you can't measure very easily. Thirdly, it might be true for certain boys. Certainly, there's better evidence that male schools are better for black boys, for example, particularly if they're black male teachers. The other thing that's just really hard to take out of these studies is one of the reasons why boys might do better at boys' schools, and they do, but the problem is they're selecting into those schools, right? They're not random, is that there are so many more male teachers there. So a good experiment would be to say, well, God, how would it be if, like, we had 50% male teachers all the way through the system? Like, if your elementary schools had as many male as female teachers, then maybe that is really what's getting at. So maybe it's not the fact that it's so much single sex and more the fact that that means you've got more male teachers. We just don't know. But I will say that the evidence would need to be really strong for that to become a very big public policy. We're not going to sex segregate our public school system anytime soon. And so I'm not against them. And at that GEM school, fabulous. Be great to see how it works. I only identified it because it just jumped out at me as like, well, that's interesting. It would be fun to see someone set up an all-boys middle school in Nevada, charter school, because middle school is where a lot of the problems hit in. Maybe deliberately recruit male teachers, etc. That would be super interesting to see. And then if you designed it correctly with some sort of lottery system, you could see what effect it was having. So I'd love to get more evidence on this. And we just did that all-girls middle school. Great, great. Let's do a boys one too. Why not?
Another
Yes,
data
there.
point.
So, Zachary, yes. I think you can speak.
Question?
Yeah, it's Zachary. Right now.
Hi, and thank you for your presentation. I do have a question. So I wanted to know, what further degradation do you think this type of rhetoric that's expressed in your book would, what kind of effect is this having further on the male psyche? It seems like men are already having a lot of trouble performing in the education system. I feel like automatically holding a child back based off of character traits that they're born with is very dangerous. And especially when you say stuff like black males, they're already facing many challenges.
Yes.
Automatically holding them back based off of what they're born with, I think that's pretty dangerous. And especially when they already have a lot of barriers to accessing quality education. So what is this doing further to the male psyche?
I take it very seriously that we have to be careful how we talk about this stuff, because I think there's a danger that we say, what's wrong with you, basically. There's this old saying that, the problem is what's wrong with you? And that's something the left and right agree on, by the way. It's just that the right say they're not masculine enough, and the left say they're too masculine. But they do agree that you're the problem. What I'm trying to do is say, no, it's the systems that are the problem. It's the structures that are the problem, by and large. I'm trying to get it away from that message that it's your fault. And that's the spirit in which I do the red shirting proposal, which is that I think everything I look at means that just developmentally it will advantage boys. And if they all do it, and it becomes the norm, it's not stigmatizing. Right now, and you mentioned the specific issue around black boys, right now, 1 in 4 black boys are held back a grade before finishing high school. Okay, that's a lot. And I'm going to suggest that that's much more damaging than red-shirting all the boys of all races right from the beginning. Than of realizing in 9th or 10th grade that, wow, this isn't working, we're going to have to hold them back. Great. Right? I think the social consequences of that are much greater. So I'm trying to move away from an individualistic approach. But I do acknowledge that the language here is really important. Just pointing out problems for certain groups can sometimes add to the sense there's something wrong with them. But given that that's the entire rhetoric about boys and men right now anyway, I'm willing to run that risk to try and say, no, maybe it's the school system that's not working. When 1 in 4 boys have been diagnosed with a developmental disability, which they have, it's reasonable to ask, is it the boys really? Or is it something about the schools? And that's the question I'm trying to get us to ask and to take seriously as a solution. And that would help all boys, but especially those with less advantage. All right, I don't know which way to go now, but there's so many questions that I'm going to get shot if we keep going. But I'm going to default to students, and I'm going to default to people I haven't heard from before. So yes, there. Sorry. You, yes. Just go ahead, shout.
Okay, so
Don't shout. All right, miss.
So I'm kind of curious. Do I have it
Yeah.
like this? Oh, sorry. Okay. So I'm pretty curious. You talked about in the beginning, you cited 2 specific words. You said worthless and useless were the 2 words that men said when they talked about killing themselves.
Yes.
And so how I interpreted this, and correct me if this was not the point you're trying to convey, was that the breadwinning was some kind of imperative aspect to like male sensation, right? Like that there's something about that, like being a moneymaker and having a career and taking in money that makes men feel worth it. And I'm wondering do you think that sensation of breadwinning actually helps men develop impulse control? Because even in the graphs you showed, it seemed that even males of age 25 still had much lower impulse control than women.
Correct.
And so I'm wondering if maybe culturally we could kind of present careers in a way where we present like developing careers and the chasing of knowledge as like sensations to chase, and do you think that could develop more of an impulse in men at a younger age? Because
Wow.
even anecdotally,
Yeah.
I've seen that a lot of guys right now, like on TikTok, and this is part of a result of like, I speak from a young perspective, so this might be kind of interesting, but like, and this is a result of like the alt-right pipelines and the educate are getting really into like lifting and like stocks and stuff
Yeah.
like that and economics. And it's because it is still chasing sensation. They want to be jacked and they want to get women and they want to have money and be at the top of society, but it develops good habits and impulse control at a young age. So I'm
Well,
kind of curious.
good.
Just what you
Well,
think
that's
about
great. I love the way you framed the last bit of that. It's like there's some good stuff in there too.
Yeah.
So I think what really matters is that for everybody needs to be needed in some way. Needed by somebody, by your kids, by your family, by your community, by your church, by your university, whatever. And so that need to be needed is what's at stake here. And historically, men have actually had a very clear reason why they're needed, and it has been through the breadwinner model. Given that that's not true to anything like the same extent anymore, the question is, okay, how else might I be needed, given that I do not have exclusive access to that source of meaning anymore? And that's why I think we do need to think about things like fatherhood. That's why we do need to worry about other institutions as well. And actually, you're quite right that the evidence suggests that responsible and engaged fatherhood is associated with, surprise, surprise, less risk-taking. It's true that men will just take themselves more seriously, think about their own well-being when someone else is relying on them. And so I do think that kind of this message of you still matter as a dad, whether you're married to the mum or not, whether you're making money or not, is crucially important. And it's getting lost right now. It's lost between the old messages, of course you matter as a dad, you're a breadwinner and a husband, or now we don't need you anymore. It's very heteronormative to say that dads matter, right? And between those two extremes fall millions and millions of men who just get the message from society like, yeah, we can probably do without you. And that's a fatal message. Now, I'm up against time now, Bill, right? Okay, one at the back there. So I'm very sorry, I can't see very well. But...
Hey there.
Hey.
I've got two questions, kind of separate. The first is, do you see with manufacturing moving more an investment in construction and manufacturing in the United States as a response of the Inflationary Reduction Act? Do you think that will help to spur more opportunity for boys and men in the spaces that are more traditional? And then the second question is, I think it was on slide 25, you had occupations that men were predominantly in that are now considered to be female occupations, education being one of them.
Yeah.
At the same time, over the last 2 decades, we don't have the same type of cultural appreciation for teachers. We don't pay teachers the same way. So when we talk about structural barriers in gender, do you almost think that, yeah, like men are leaving some of these professions and we need to get them back in, but at the same time, because now they're seen as female professions, we don't value them as much as a society. So there are still gender disparities against women, just in a different way.
Right. Thank you. So what was the first question? Sorry. Just give me the short version of the first question, because I've forgotten the first one. Sure, thank you. Whoever that was in the audience, thank you for summarizing that. One of the things, so yes, the infrastructure bill in particular will actually be very pro-male. But you wouldn't know that because the administration won't say that. Actually, 2/3 of the jobs will go to men, predominantly working class men, and disproportionately working class men of color, especially Hispanic men. Now, you might think just from a political perspective, they might want to say that, given what's happening to the trend, right? But they don't say that. We know that because a women's think tank pointed that out to show that women were going to miss out on that investment. Whereas student loan cancellation, debt cancellation was described by the administration as a gender justice issue because 2/3 of college debt is held by women. Seems to me you've got to go one way or the other on this, right? And actually just own the fact this is good for working class men. Investing in infrastructure is good for working class men. Why isn't that a good thing? Why wouldn't you say that? And the answer is because you're afraid. You're afraid you'll get attacked for saying that. So yes, it is good for men, and I think we should say so. And on the second point about professions, yes, it's true that K-12 teachers basically haven't had much of a pay rise for the last 20 years. And it's also true that men are a bit more sensitive to salary than women are in the choice of jobs for reasons that would take too long to get into here now, but it's true, at least for now. And so that's an additional barrier to getting more men in to those professions. But I don't think now that it's largely because, oh, those are women's professions, we don't need to pay them as well anymore. That was quite a strong view, and there was some pretty good evidence for that historically, but I don't see the evidence for that as much anymore. And the fact that nurses are now making so much more money, is actually a counterexample of that, because nursing is much more female dominated than those others, and nurses can make really pretty good money. It seems to me the big factor here is those are public jobs, and they're big in number. And so giving teachers a pay rise is very expensive, and they're not willing to raise the taxes to do it. So I don't think anymore that it's largely because, oh, well, women don't need as much money, so we won't pay teachers as well. I think it's just we're not willing to pay teachers enough, period. It has that second round effect of making it even harder to attract men into the profession, which is one reason we should do it, but it's not the main reason we should do it. We should pay teachers properly just anyway. And if that has this byproduct of making it easier to attract men, that would be a good thing for sure. But if you look at the female professions where the pay is going up, like nursing, that's a good counterexample to that. So I'm less worried about that, but I am worried about teacher pay generally. And with that, I'm getting the sign that we're going to have to stick around. So if you have more questions, then... So Mackenzie's jumping up and down. Look, Tom's... All right, Mackenzie, if you do it in 10 seconds and I can answer in 15 seconds, let's let Mackenzie do it. Go on. How can we do, Mackenzie? Can I invoke privilege? Go on, Mackenzie, go on.
Okay, so segueing back to your to the previous question, I know these aren't gender-targeted policies, but do you still think that there's an inherent value in things like collective bargaining rights and like occupational licensing reform that could help men, especially lower-class men who like don't have like the education to like achieve those like high-credential, high-paying jobs anymore?
Great, thank you. So the question you probably all got about collective bargaining, et cetera. I think the answer is that mostly that's going to be a class effect and it would help workers generally. The occupational licensing one I think is an interesting one, but I see a lot more female-dominated jobs that are actually being held back by occupational licensing, especially in things like healthcare, for example. So I think on average, if anything, it might help women more than men. But I think the broader point you're making is right, which is that unless we can find ways to increase the economic rewards for both men and women in some of these jobs, particularly in the bottom half of the labor market distribution, then we're all in trouble. And those families are in trouble. So the only reason that middle-class families have seen any increase in their income at all in recent decades, and it's very small, it's because of women doing more work. So men are actually a slight drag on middle-class incomes, and they're only just making ends meet by women going to work more, which is great, to be clear. But at the same time, we want a world where, just as is my earlier work too, where we're really thinking about this in terms of families and economics. And one of the reasons I'm so worried about boys and men is because boys raised in poverty and inequality do worse. That means they'll do worse as men, which means their families will be poorer, which means their kids will suffer more. And so the cycle will turn. And so that's, I think, the intervention point that I would go to. Thank you.